The city of St. Paul is about to vote on the most strict rent control policy in the entire country. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's coming out of the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. And as most people know, Minnesota is a very tenant-friendly state. They're very anti-landlord, much more progressive state. And they've put in place a lot of these policies that are very unfriendly to landlords. And this rent control policy is actually going to be coming up to a vote pretty soon. But before I get into that article, go ahead, hit that like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what else you want to see on this channel. I'm, of course, still bringing you articles about the eviction moratorium, but it's nice to bring you other news that's of interest to landlords as well. So, this article comes from MinnesotaReformer.com, and it says, "Here's the rent control question St. Paul will vote on this fall." And wow, I'm just saying wow, because it is absolutely crazy how far this rent control policy they're going to vote on goes. It goes further than the rent control policies in New York or California. Okay, so this thing would be absolutely awful for any landlords that are doing business in St. Paul. And the reason I bring this up, these rent control things, you keep hearing about them. This is where we are going as a country. A lot of these progressives are pushing this sort of thing all over. And you could look up, and even places like Nebraska or Alabama or places that are normally known as being very landlord friendly could end up underneath some of these rent control laws. And you just need to be aware that this is what's out there. So let's get into the article and see what it says. The St. Paul City Council unanimously approved the rent control ballot language that will be put to voters this November. If passed, the measure would institute one of the country's most rigorous rent stabilization policies and the state's first. The ballot language, drafted by city staff to reflect a citizen-led petition, would limit landlords from increasing rent more than 3% per year on all units throughout the city. The City Council approved the language without discussion on Wednesday. Due to the successful signature drive, the Council must essentially rubber stamp the proposal. The Housing Equity Now St. Paul Coalition presented about 5,500 valid signatures supporting the ballot initiative to election officials in June, more than required to put an ordinance change on the ballot. So yeah, they wrote the ordinance out, the proposed ordinance, and now it's going to go up for a vote in the month of November. And I'm hoping that landlords in the city, they attack this thing hard, because there's a lot to rip apart here. And this is a very, very rigorous and very, very strict rent control law. And they just need to just get rid of it. I hope that the people of St. Paul aren't foolish enough to believe that this is actually going to help tenants and that this is going to help keep rents low, because it's going to have the opposite effect. In fact, what it will probably do is it will push rents within the city higher, or cause a lot of properties to fall into disrepair because landlords aren't able to make any money. Okay, so then the landlords, what they're going to do is they're going to move outside the city. St. Paul is a part of a large metropolitan area, and they are not the majority of the area. So if the whole area isn't under rent control, then landlords will move, people will move. It could be a disaster, and they don't even realize it yet. Now that St. Paul has one of the strongest tenant protections in the state, we need rent stabilization to make sure our neighbors aren't pushed out of their communities, said Danielle Swift, an organizer from the Frogtown Neighborhood Association, during a news conference announcing the campaign in March. Unlike policies in other cities, St. Paul's proposed ordinance is not tied to inflation. In California, which instituted rent stabilization last year, landlords may increase rent up to 5% plus the local rate of inflation. In Oregon, which approved rent stabilization in 2019, landlords are limited to raising rent no more than 7% per year plus the rate of inflation. So yeah, in Oregon and in California, and these are other places that are extremely progressive, where they do have rent control laws in place, right? they are allowed to increase the rents up to 5% per year in California and up to 7% per year in Oregon. And on top of that, the amount of inflation. So like this year, there's been a ton of inflation. So, prices are up 5%. So in California, you could theoretically increase your rents by 10% this year if they're going off of that 5% inflation increase. And in Oregon, up to 12% this year. But St. Paul's will say just 3%. You're limited to 3%. Doesn't matter what inflation is. So this could hit landlords hard. We don't know where inflation will be in the future, so the choice of 3% is kind of interesting. One might think you'd want to avoid such rigidity, said Mark Willis, a senior policy fellow at New York University's Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. If inflation never goes above 3%, that's one thing. But if it does, that could spur lots of owners to appeal, which, if not successful, could lead to long-term problems with the ability of owners to properly maintain the stock. Yeah. And that's a huge problem, because guess what? Property taxes always increase, okay? The cost of maintenance is going to increase, okay? The cost of utilities is going to increase, okay? The cost of everything is going to increase over time. And these property owners, if they aren't able to do increases of rent that'll keep up with inflation, then they are just going to just start losing money. And that's just not the way that business is done. So that will lead to a lot of landlords just not even wanting to do maintenance, and a lot of landlords not even wanting to do business in that city. If passed, St. Paul also would not exempt new construction from the law, as most other places have done. This raises the specter of developers pulling out of the city, even as it confronts a severe housing shortage. During Wednesday's meeting, the council also overwhelmingly approved eliminating parking requirements for new developments in an effort to boost new construction and respond to climate change. So yeah, they're not going to even exempt new construction. So if a landlord comes in there, or a developer comes in there and decides that, hey, I want to build a new 300 unit apartment complex, help resolve some of this housing shortage issue, well, they are still stuck underneath this same rent control policy as everyone else. Now, most other places, like in California and New York, they exempt buildings under a certain age, so that way they can still spur new development. But in St. Paul, nope, no one's exempt. The rent control ordinance also does not allow landlords to increase rents to market rate once a tenant moves out, a so-called vacancy decontrol, which renter advocates say will prevent landlords from pushing out tenants to find higher paying renters. Yeah, that's another thing that they don't mention. But like in California and New York, once the rent control tenant moves out, in a lot of cases, they're able to raise the rents in that unit up to the market rate. And so therefore, they're able to make more money off of that next tenant. But no, you can't do that in this St. Paul legislation. It's crazy how much crap they put into this St. Paul legislation, thinking that this is going to be a good idea. It's going to discourage landlords. That's the only thing it's going to do. And while other cities have exempted small-time landlords, St. Paul's ordinance would not distinguish between a person who rents out a single house and a corporate owner with a portfolio of hundreds of units. The ordinance would allow landlords to request an exemption based on the right to a reasonable rate of return. For example, if property taxes increase or significant improvements are required to bring the unit into compliance with city code. So yeah, you have to beg the city, please let me raise the rent so I can pay my taxes. What a joke. I can't believe they're even putting something like this into place. And they're not even exempting small landlords. So you're a person who owns one single family home as a rental, and guess what? You're stuck under the same rent control ordinance as everyone else. So yeah, that goes beyond anything that they're doing up in New York, California, Oregon, Washington State. This is absolutely insane. And I hope the people of St. Paul, they can see through this ridiculousness. And I hope the landlords up there are fighting hard against it, because they will be ruined if this kind of thing takes place, okay? And I know that tenants, they think that rent control is a good thing, but it's not. It really is not. It only ends up with a shortage in housing stock and unaffordable housing for the people who really need it.